I'm just going to say welcome. Thank you very much to all of our speakers who have given up what actually turns out to be, one of the nicest evenings of the year. And thank you to everyone who is also coming in to listen to our speakers. So my name is Professor Nikki Marsh. I work at the University of Southampton, and I am one of the directors of Southampton Institute for Arts and Humanities. And I'm here tonight representing an AHRC programme called Feeling Towns, Place and Identity in Local Governance. And I'm representing it on behalf of the two colleagues who are on my screen, at least on either side of me, which is Dr. Joseph Owen and Dr. Michael Howcroft, who are also researchers on the project. And as is the way with these things, and as I always say, are the people who are doing most of the actual work. So I defer to them both on all things. This is the programme Feeling Towns is part of an AHRC place-based programme of knowledge exchange projects. There's about 9 projects in all, and it's led by Professor Rebecca Madgen, who's also on the call. And there's 3 strands to this project. I'm just going to give a little bit of a context so you can kind of see why we're doing this evening and the project that this evening is part of. So the first thing we're doing with this project is we're working with local partners. We're working with Darlington, Hereford, Birkenhead, and now more recently Southampton, to understand their needs and their responses to the kind of question of pride, particularly as it features in central government policy and it features in the Levelling Up and the Towns Fund agenda. So we're working with kind of doing field work that Joseph's leading on in all of these places to understand what pride means in place right now in 2022 to these very specific communities and what the needs of those who are seeking government funding are in relationship to that as a question. The second part of the project is we're working with a series of national organisations, and particularly with Historic England, to understand how they can develop their own metrics for pride in the kind of heritage sector, and again, how they can measure the relationship between pride and place, collective pride, which Gavin will be talking about shortly, something that's very important to them, and pride and heritage, because their own research suggests that pride is an enormously significant motivator for people's relationship to heritage, why they go there. And then the third part of the project is about basically enabling conversations around policy and pride as it's running through the national agenda in the UK this year, quite kind of visibly. And we're trying to enable 2 kinds of conversations, and one is with our community of practice, that's arts and heritage organisations. There are the people in our case study towns, that's local government and national government, so they can bring these different perspectives together. And I'll talk a little bit more about that community of practice at the end. And then the second strand of this kind of sharing knowledge exchange is things like tonight, when we're trying to have a kind of public conversation around disciplines, across the sectors, across institutions, around what pride is, so that we can begin to collectively interrogate and think more carefully about some of the assumptions that are embedded in that language as they're being rolled out right now. So that's why we're doing pride. That's why we're doing pride in this way tonight. And now very, very quickly, because as I was saying to our speakers at the beginning, we're kind of all familiar with this as a format now. So I'm just going to do the housekeeping. And the housekeeping is this is being recorded. We would like to share this on our SEA and our Feeling Towns website afterwards. So just want to let people know that if they swear, it will be there forever. And then the other thing to say, we've got 5 10-minute papers. We're going to take all of those 5 papers consecutively, so we can have some kind of discussion, collective discussion and chat in the last half hour. As you can see, the audience mics and cameras are turned off at the moment. If you'd like to enter, if you want to kind of engage in the conversation, please do use the chat function. And then afterwards, when we've heard all the papers, then you can turn your cameras on and turn your mic on and represent yourself, or you can stay silent and I will represent you as a compare and read from the questions. So I think that is it for everything for me. Now I'm going to ask if I remembered everything, Joseph and Michael. I have. So I'm going to turn now to Michael, who is our first speaker for the evening. This is Dr. Michael Howcroft from the University of Southampton. He's the co-I on this project, and he's also a researcher on the Spaces of Hope project based at the University of Sheffield on urban planning. And Michael's paper is called Pride and Political Culture in Hull, and it comes from his PhD. Thank you, Michael.
Great. Thanks very much, Nikki, and thank you all for coming. Can you see my slides? Yeah. We can, yeah. Great, thank you. So I intend this talk as something of a warm-up for our other speakers, and I hope that it will introduce some of the themes, questions and challenges around researching pride and the role of pride in local policy that will be explored in the coming presentations. As well as our Feeling Towns work that Nikki's already talked to you about, it draws on my PhD, which via Pride and Shame drew links between recent cultural and political behaviours in Hull, which is where I was born and grew up. Very quickly, Hull in 2016, Hull voted overwhelmingly to leave the European Union. It was the second highest Brexit city in the country. And in 2017, Hull hosted the UK City of Culture, a year-long celebration of place. In 2021, the UK City of Culture was Coventry, and with some frustration for colleagues in Southampton, in 2025, City of Culture has been announced as Bradford. For many commentators, Hull being a Brexit city and a city of culture was something of a strange conjuncture. And some commentators asked how a Brexit city could be a cultural city. And in that kind of questioning, there's a whole set of assumptions that Brexit places are parochial and inward looking, whereas cultural cities are somehow more cosmopolitan and outward looking. So I wanted to investigate those assumptions. And I wanted to do that by asking the people of Hull themselves. So I asked 50 to 60 different people in the city. Some were politicians, some are journalists, some were from the cultural sector, but most of them weren't experts like that. Most of them were experts on being residents of the city of Hull. And I wanted to ask them what they thought about the assumptions about the city and how Brexit and UK City of Culture might change the city. Specifically, I asked them to imagine what a post-Brexit and post-City of Culture future for Hull might be, based on the theoretical framework of the civic imaginary. And the civic imaginary, as outlined here, is the collective, inventive, prospective thinking about the societies in which we live. So place is absolutely central to this framework. And the social scientists amongst you will know that if you ask people to talk about the future, then they'll often start by reflecting on what they want to change in the present. And in some cases, perhaps they'll look to the past for some of the answers. I probably shouldn't, but I was really surprised that in virtually every single interview, even though I didn't ask about people's feelings, the first thing that participants talked about, and they would say that the future for Hull would be a proud future. And there was some nuance between Leave and Remain voters about this, but that pride was somehow related to no longer being a left behind or a crap town. And you can see in some of these images that are based on creative methods that I used, some of the kind of language that people used. And not only did they talk about pride, but also expressions of shame and embarrassment at coming from or living in Hull. They were in every single research interview that I did, and often in the language of waste or crapness. And this kind of language articulates the negative feelings of territorial stigmatization, which I'm pretty sure Alice will speak about in more detail later, that's associated with Hull as peripheral or marginal, not only in its physical, but also its socio-economic and political geographies. Given that this kind of experience is replicated throughout the UK, though with very specific local meanings and circumstances, it's perhaps no surprise that raising civic pride has risen to the fore as a key policy objective through Boris Johnson's post-Brexit levelling up agenda. And as we can see from the Labour benches, a similar language and emphasis around pride and place. It perhaps follows a trend of initiatives such as the Wellbeing Index and the OECD's key priority of measuring well-being and progress. Fortier suggests that these kinds of initiatives can be understood as affect, becoming a mode of categorizing, classifying, and coding populations. So we might then understand them as the metrics of emotional governance. In other words, if you can measure it, you can manage it. And Thomas Sheff claims that pride and shame may be the most powerful forces in the human world. Forces that I think, when coupled with place and a place's inherent issues of boundary, governance, and identity, can be significantly amplified and politicised. The emotional manipulation of publics as a political tool isn't a new idea, of course, but post-Brexit, we're seeing a new emphasis on the emotions of place and pride in place specifically. And whilst I think it's wise that we're wary of how, in particular, a singular kind of place-based pride is mobilised through contemporary political discourse, there's still a lot we can learn about the political and social efficacy of pride. And I think that Gavin and Jack will probably talk a little bit more later in their talks about what pride might do for communities and places and how it might do that. Reclaiming pride has been enormously powerful in addressing stigmatization of many kinds, affecting legal and social change and providing a positive sense of identity and community for many. One of the things I was particularly interested about with Pride and the broader civic agenda raised through Levelling Up and its various competitively structured funds is what impact it might have on cultural and heritage organisations. One very senior cultural funder stated about Hull 2017 that the increased Pride statistic is the one that they were most excited about. And I found this quite curious because they're actually referring to a very fragile statistic that shows only a relatively modest boost in civic pride at the beginning of 2017, and that clearly dwindles towards the end of the year, reverting the following year in 2018, almost back to pre-UK City of Culture levels. So why should policymakers then be so excited by pride, which is something we've also seen in our Feeling Towns work? And what might happen to cultural and heritage programming if organisations are expected to demonstrate how they positively boost levels of local pride? An often overlooked dynamic of Hull's political culture is that the city's turnout at elections is increasingly one of the lowest in the country. In the 2019 general election, they did have the 3 Hull constituencies have the lowest turnout in the country. And in the 2021 local elections, many wards had less than 25% turnout. And you can see there, I won't read the whole thing out, but a quote there from one of my participants, again using the language of shitness and crapness, that this kind of feeling about politics has made him apathetic about everything. And it's perhaps what some observers have argued is the outcome of several decades of anti-politics. One of the impacts of anti-politics is that it creates an ideological void, so that emotion becomes the driving force of politics, and political competence tied to the ability to manage emotions. The expression rather than repression of emotion therefore becomes a source of political capital. And I think Will might, in his talk, discuss some recent polling on pride and contemporary political sentiment. Whilst some might argue that celebratory pride boosting initiatives such as Hull 2017 can't do any harm, and that might be true, my research in Hull has shown how mass participation in a cultural programme such as Hull 2017 didn't necessarily mean increased engagement in political processes. In fact, it went down. And finally, how can we take account of the multitudes of pride that exist in our communities? It's clear from talking to our research partners that a more nuanced language around pride that takes account of this, plus co-produced evaluative metrics for understanding pride and place, are needed. As one local government officer stated, we don't have the language to do a levelling up evaluation because the town's fund metrics don't match the vision of the town investment plan. So there's a gap there between national needs and local needs. And finally, to conclude, place-based pride is multiple, slippery, and fragile. Its multiplicities and temporalities make it hard to sustain and even harder to measure. And the emotion is bound in issues of political and ethical responsibility. How can the levelling up agenda account for multitudes of pride? Thank you, Joseph, for that phrase. And how can local authorities and organisations that might have to collect pride data have a role in co-producing definitions and metrics? Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael. And I'm going to hand over to our second speaker, who is Gavin Sullivan. Gavin is a professor at the International Psychiatry University in Berlin. He is a social psychologist working on individual, group-based and collective affect and emotion. Two of his recent books include Wittgenstein's Philosophy in Psychology and Understanding Collective Pride and Group Identity. And Gavin also has some kind of related papers on open access that you can get to through ResearchGate, which are freely available for all of us to read. If you want me to just make you aware of. And Gavin's paper tonight is called Civic, Pride, Individual and Collective Features. Thanks, Gavin.
Great, thank you. Well, yeah, it's really exciting to hear this discussion. When I was a PhD student in the late 90s in Christchurch, New Zealand, I wouldn't have imagined that people would be taking up this topic with such energy. And it is important, I think. And what I'll try to do is take you through kind of some of the kind of everyday senses of civic pride in both the individual and the collective features. So particularly, I'll explore everyday forms of civic pride to give you kind of an idea of how this can be conceptualized, and include then some academic perspectives on civic pride. Of course, Michael gave some key figures, introduction to some key figures, and I might allude to some of those given the time that I have. And also then at the end, kind of a so what question. You know, what can we do with these kind of insights, and then also the contributions of recent work on pride. And so kind of thinking through just some of the everyday forms of pride. It's interesting with pride that there are these different forms of it. So you can have considerable variation in what individuals are proud of, you know, what I will be proud of. And then also in terms of what we might emphasize in terms of our everyday discourse about pride. It's important also to look at how that's manifest in an everyday sense. You know, sometimes it can be just simply an individual sharing information or kind of talking in positive terms about where they come from, you know, sharing that with others. And sometimes that can be quite idiosyncratic as well. The things that I might, you know, love about Coventry might be very different to what other people kind of would highlight. But sometimes also we can converge on something that's more collective. And I'll talk a little about some of these different academic ways of thinking of pride shortly. The kind of objects or focus of pride, whether it's individual or this more collective group kind of form, can be numerous. Cultural heritage, for example, it could be old buildings, but it could be recent buildings. It can be events. So obviously recurrent events, festivals can be sources of pride when they're located in a particular region or city. It can be representatives. So it can be anything from clubs, a local football club, of course. Universities can be sources of pride. There can be kind of key historical and contemporary figures in politics and culture, you know, just the kinds of sharing of pride where someone says, well, so-and-so came from here. Economic performance and factors such as levels of inequality, the environment, the differences between parts of the city, they can often underpin a sense of liking, belonging, belonging to, and also feeling attached to place. And that topic, though, of attachment to place is a little problematic because it sometimes gives the impression that attachment to place is a little like being attached to a caregiver. So we must always kind of be careful of naturalizing kind of pride. Pride is often highly socially and historically and culturally constructed and varies accordingly. As I was saying, you know, examples of everyday forms of pride can be a sense of liking. And sometimes it is important to look at the overlap between kind of positive emotions, the liking, well-being, and also then pride, which can manifest on the basis of that kind of liking and general involvement or interest in a place. So I mentioned wanting to talk positively about a place, the city that we live in, one lives in. And that can include promoting one's place or origin, of course, and that can fluctuate as features of local investment or demographic makeup change, of course. So these are quite obviously fluctuate a great deal. Other consequences, though, of higher levels of civic pride are interesting to explore as well. They can be quite varied, from willingness to volunteer in events and projects, or it can simply be the support or the contribution to local improvement projects, for example, the extent to which people encourage that rather than oppose it. Pride, of course, may also deflect from or cover from potential sources of localized shame. We saw already, some indications of Brexit and some of the complications that have occurred in terms of national identities around Brexit. And so that's also an issue of kind of where people living in areas where they feel that politicians don't listen to them, that is important to explore, because it can indicate some of the national ways in which people hope to make a particular place good or great again. In terms of academic perspectives, I would say what's interesting also, at least about the academic work on civic pride, is it's tended in the past to be kind of positioned in a hierarchy. And the hierarchies sometimes don't show how just nested and complicated in everyday life these phenomena are. I might be talking about my own achievements at one minute. I might switch to talking about what's good or bad about the region and how I talk about it. I might switch then to possibilities for national pride. So it's interesting to see how these are nested or quite complex, at least in everyday forms. In the research on national pride, for example, you see often a focus on civic pride and then also on regional pride and then national pride. So some of the work I did very long time ago on responses to the World Cup in Germany kind of examined this issue of kind of these hierarchies of pride and how they sometimes complement and sometimes contrast each other. I mean, a good example of this is Liverpool fans booing the national anthem at Wembley. That tells you something actually about resilience. That's really interesting, and opposing an identity that they feel doesn't include them. I've written also about kind of some of the complexities here between what's called individual pride of my own personal achievements, then what's called group-based pride, and then forms of collective pride, where these are experienced together as individuals, where there are celebrations, for example, where this might be public viewing of England football games. That's a kind of one manifestation, a collective way in which a pride occurs in a celebration. Some of these contexts are really important to explore. So there is celebration. We see this at the national level, the civic level, but there's also competition. And to what extent does that occur between regions or particular cities? And then it's also important to look at challenges. COVID was a challenging time for many cities. How do people respond to that? Did they respond in terms of resilience? For example, did they say that this is how we survive this, and did it contribute to cohesion? There's also conflict, the much bigger issues of kind of conflict that I've written about as a way of thinking of different forms of pride and shame and how they relate in this paper with Chris Day. So just to kind of finish up, I guess, in academic perspectives, I would give an example of something like a place like Coventry. And I genuinely say I'm proud to have lived in Coventry. I don't live in Coventry at the moment, but I'm a proud Coventarian, I guess I would say. So examples of celebration, of course, are local sports successes, promotion of Coventry City to the championship. But then those celebrations were actually undermined by potential racism and some conflict that occurred with two Black men in the center of Coventry, right in the middle of those celebrations. So it's very complex how pride and shame can relate in situations like this. It's easy for celebrations to go wrong, for example. Also, of course, there's the extended attention, you know, the kind of imagined attention of others shouldn't be undermined as a source of pride. So, for example, work I did on the World Cup in South Africa, people really did feel this sense that the world is watching us. So this can occur for national or international events. Competition, a good example of that's the kind of celebrations around the City of Culture win. But then there can be also a sense of competing with other regions and sometimes a feeling of kind of punching up, so to speak, of kind of punching above one's weight in city terms. Challenges, I mentioned COVID, and you know the challenges for any city of addressing inequalities that are obvious. University-related building is one issue for Coventry. Local residents kind of challenged some of the building that it was taking over the center of the city. Wasn't addressing issues such as local housing. A very different topic, which I've done research on in Indonesia, is potential disasters due to natural hazards. This is a quite different topic, but when we move from kind of challenges into conflicts, we're potentially looking at forms of pride that are very much more like resilience. They can be also quite defensive. They can be, it can be in relation to victories, I guess, that can be called Pyrrhic. So a final quick so what slide. I think I've gone about a minute over maybe. I would say the intensity of positive and negative group-based and collective emotions will be the product of common goals, shared identity, and normative commitments. You know, there's a lot going on that needs to be explored. I tend to look at what's called an affective practices approach, which really looks at what people are doing and how they're doing it. So we should, I think, always try to explore everyday patterns of local civic pride, the meaning-making discourses and activities. When is pride expressed? You know, when is the opportunity for pride? What do people actually do? Is it sitting around chatting about what's good, remembering things, or is it saying, you know, won't it be great when this is built, or that's different? And where do these activities take place? You know, the collective forms of those are also networks. So it's where individuals are networked and connected with others that can manifest these emotions across those networks. And I would say a final issue is just, you can always do what's called future-focused research. You can ask, you know, what would need to change or be different in order for you and or members of your community to feel proud of your city or more pride. And you'll be amazed at what that generates. Thank you.
That's fantastic, Gavin. Thank you so much. It's really wide-ranging and really open and generous, actually. There's lots of places that we can go with this. So thank you for that. Really, really productive. My next speaker is Professor Will Jennings, who is a professor of political science and public policy here, as if we're anywhere, at the University of Southampton. And Will's recent projects include a large ESRC project called TrustGov, which looks at worldwide patterns of trust and governance. He was a co-founder of the Centre for Towns think tank and has done a lot of research on levelling up and kind of querying what levelling up means. And some of his recent books include The Politics of Competence and The Good Politician. And Will tonight is going to talk about some recent research called Pride and Recent Polling. Professor Jennings, thank you.
Thanks, Nikki. And I'm going to be terribly old-fashioned and just talk at you rather than give you some PowerPoint slides. It's been a very long day. So, I mean, just to start, I think, you know, I've approached this from quite a different perspective. Hopefully what I'm going to say builds quite nicely on what Michael and Gavin have been talking about, actually. But I've started this from a very different perspective. I became interested in place, you know, by a different route as a political scientist, by this kind of increasing evidence that place discontent was an increasing driver of our politics with Brexit, but not just Brexit. Actually, you see in electoral patterns the sort of increasing divides between different parts of the country. And so from that perspective, I started asking questions around place, identity, the association of distance from London, the capital, from Westminster, its entanglement with populist politics, with anti-politics, as we explore in the kind of The Good Politician was really not a book about geography, it was a book about anti-politics, but increasingly geography, place, place have become sort of entwined with that. And what I'll mainly talk to you about today is in a recent bit of a project, with Arnon Menon at King's College and Paula Surridge, and Alan Wager at King's College as well, Paula Surridge at University of Bristol, and Lawrence Mackay from the Trust God Project in Southampton. We've done a very large poll, national poll around civic pride and place and levelling up, and I'll talk through a few aspects of findings from that research, which might hopefully inform some of the discussion here. We should have a report out in a month or so, so you're going to get some of the sneak preview findings just to give you a flavour. We haven't yet got to the stage of doing any fine-grained geographical analysis linking that data to towns specifically, or different towns in the north or the south, for example. But I think already some of the findings will give you a little bit of a flavour of how at that sort of national level that sort of sense of civic pride plays out in different ways. And I think it tallies with many of the things that Michael and Gavin were saying. So in the survey, we asked a range of things that I'll talk through. We started off by asking people where they're proud of their area, and actually around 2/3 of people are. So it's an interesting thing that we can talk about this sense of, oh, crisis, there's a kind of, this world of crisis, but actually people tend to be proud of their area. There's no sort of Brexit or party political divide. Actually, interestingly, again, there's sort of a push including political scientists like myself, to sometimes talk as if the world is incredibly polarized. But when you ask people about their area, they're proud. 2/3 are proud of it. And actually, when we ask people also, would they rather live in their area than anywhere else, the number of people saying they wanted to live in their area was 44% to 27% of people who said they want to leave, actually. So there's actually a sense in which we already have levels of civic pride when you ask people sort of fairly crude, simple survey questions. I know there are much deeper methods that others use, but I think, that tells us something. And we also asked, how strongly do you identify as being from a particular village, town or city in England? And around half of people said they did. And that's lower than national identity, right? So we're still in a world of politics dominated by national identity, but it's still pretty significant. And it's something that, with my work with Centre for Towns, we're always very conscious of, that local versions of identity actually influence politics in different ways. I think it's actually, being based in the South, where we don't have that sort of as strong regional identity. There was another recent project, I think recently, that had some polling suggesting that northern regional identity and place-based identity is much stronger. But I think we do broadly have, nationally a fairly strong sense of place. Now, one of the questions we asked in our survey was around a series of things that we asked, are these important for creating a sense of pride in your area? And I'll just give you some highlights. I mean, what was really striking from this, we gave people things like the football club, museums and libraries, local pubs, the high street. The number one thing that people said create a sense of pride in their area was local parks and green spaces. So 89% of people said that. Interesting, the people who live here was the next task, 85%, right? And then fascinating, local employers and businesses at 80%, followed by the high street, right? Actually, I was quite surprised by local employers and business, real sense that actually, when you ask people, I think on this level, I actually think just asking these questions to people about pride, civic pride, their place, you get these sort of interesting things. The local football club came in only at 49% of people saying that, versus 61% for local pubs, right? So actually, we often talk about, kind of on a ethnic, and I know, of course, football clubs are deeply important to sub-communities within areas, but actually, these sort of green spaces, parks, I thought was fascinating. That sort of sense of place, very much associated with physical spaces, local parks, high streets, but also people. So I think that's a really interesting finding. I mean, what is certainly true, saying we do have this civic pride, look at the kind of headline data, there are a broad sense in which people are proud of their area. We asked people about their nearest high street specifically, the place nearest them with a significant number of shops and retail outlets. And we asked, would you say that your local high street has got better or worse in the last 10 years? And a large majority of people, so 56% of people said it's got worse, just 14% better, right? So this is where place, civic, the sort of sense of our civic space starts to really matter, right? There is a real sense across the country, especially in a kind of more deprived area. We haven't dug into the data to tell you that's more than a hunch, but I'm pretty sure it will be, that our high streets are getting worse, right? And so that, so we can have civic pride while also recognizing decline. I think that duality is really important. We've asked a follow-up question, which you said that, for people who said that their high street got worse, well, why is that? The things that came up most commonly will not be surprising to you, but actually it's important to highlight them. More boarded up shops, small independent shops have closed, big retailers have closed, local bank branches have closed. And then just below that, those that more antisocial behavior and crime, and there's more litter and mess, a little bit of broken windows theory to throw it in, right? But a real sense of degradation, economic degradation of place. And I think Ian Warren, we used to work with the Centre for Towns, used to talk of the kind of the cognitive landscape of places. And I think that's really important, that people see their towns in decline. And it is very much, as we have an agglomeration-based model, although COVID has made it slightly more complicated, there is a sense in which that decline is geographically concentrated. Just to say how this sort of feeds into the anti-politics, something I'm interested in, is that actually we ask people, on a scale of 0 to 10, how much do you think different groups care about your area? We asked about the government in Westminster, and 37% of people said, there was a scale of 0 to 10, with 0 being they don't care at all about my area. 37% of people chose the most extreme negative option, which is sort of, actually when we asked about local council, there was nothing like that. Is this real sense in which people government not caring about my area is really significant. I think it is worth also noting that, we talk about place, we talk about towns versus city, but there is a very big regional element to this as well. So we asked another question, which is, we said, would you say that each of these areas gets more or less than its fair share of government spending? So there's sense of geographical bias. Lawrence McKay, who I work with, is very interested in this. The people said the north of England, 54% of people said the north of England gets less than its fair share. 32% of people said the Midlands gets less than its fair share. 10% of people said the south of England gets less than its fair share. 4% of people said London gets less than its fair share. The most fun finding I had from this whole survey was that then 53% of people said my local area gets less than its fair share. So there's a sort of discontent that people understand regional inequality, but there's also the sense in which my area is not doing as well. So that's a little real overview of this, what we're finding so far in civic pride, and we will in about a month be able to tell you a much more fine-grained account of how that links to actual objective socioeconomic conditions in places. The other thing that we looked at, because it is central to this sort of civic pride, civic regeneration agenda, was the Towns Fund and levelling up. And so we were in the survey was in the field just around the time of the launch of the second phase of levelling up. And we ran what survey methodologists call a conjoint experiment, which is where you show people A and B, two options of a set of, and you ask them to choose between it, and you show different attributes between. It actually was developed, I think, in market research. You show a kind of red and a blue car with a faster engine or a lower price, and you see what people respond to. But we did it with two policy proposals. So we said, here's a sort of policy proposal between sort of levelling up proposals, and we had lots of different attributes. So we gave people a choice between different sorts of policy, whether it was investment in schools, hospitals, town centre, improving local transport, regenerating cultural and heritage sites. We gave an option for timing, whether it should be done 2 years' time, 5 years' time, 10 years' time. We varied the amount of money spent on it. We varied whether or not it would be private or publicly delivered. We varied the decision system. So we had, as I'll talk about, bidding process judged by ministers versus a needs-based formula. Or we also asked about the involvement of the local council and the local community and the local MP, and also whether the decision-making process was transparent. And I'll tell you very briefly what we found in headline figures, some of which will not surprise you, but it's always nice to kind of give people actually a real, that's why I like conjoint experience. Instead of just saying, would you like us to spend more money on your local area? Everyone says yes. You actually give people a real dilemma and trade-off. So, interestingly, and actually this is a dilemma, I think, for the civic and kind of urban agenda, people favour hospitals and transport. They deprioritize cultural and heritage sites. Town centres were sort of middling, right? So that's actually a problem in terms of if people want particular sorts of spending, but actually they tell us that they want civic pride because of green spaces, but actually when push comes to shove, they want spending on the local hospital. That's a bit of a challenge. Unsurprisingly, people want things sooner, 2 years rather than 10 years. That's very rational. They want more spending, also very rational. They also favour public sector delivery, and they want decisions taken through a needs-based formula, followed by a bidding process judged by experts, right? So the interesting thing in research is the current political model of things being decided by ministers untransparently is the least popular mechanism for levelling up proposals, right? That's the least proposal. There was greater support for local council being involved, developing plans, the local community being consulted, and it being transparent. The final thing just to say from this process, which we're conjoint because we had such a large sample, we have a 20,000 person sample, so we had a great deal of statistical power. We looked at different age groups, and the one interesting thing was actually, this speaks a little bit to national politics, was that the groups that most favoured high street regeneration were older voters of lower education, actually the kind of archetypal new conservative voter in the red wall. I hate to use those words. And so it is actually, you know, politically on one level, you can see from the findings there is a certain political logic to the town's fund in terms of the sorts of people who found it appealing, even though at the aggregate level, the way it's been set up doesn't speak to necessarily what people want in terms of delivery. So, I mean, I'll wrap up just to say, I probably would have spoken even longer if I had slides, but just to say, I think there's, you know, some really interesting evidence there that speaks a lot to what was being said actually about the importance of civic pride, but also some of the contradictions and trade-offs that we have when talking about place in the wider context of national identities, national politics.
That was brilliant. Well, thank you so much. And it's always exciting to get those polling early. We had, I don't think he's in this webinar, but our partner with Historic England has also done some polling around what makes people proud, and that green spaces and then the people where I come from are top there as well. Which is kind of interesting because one of them you can think about as being a kind of COVID response, that our green spaces in our towns in particular became really, really important, but it was the people that we didn't see. So that's really fantastic. And being able to talk to you about the relationship between this and economic inequality, because I think our kind of qualitative data, our kind of the ways in which we're talking to some of our case studies are suggesting something quite different, that actually civic pride can be felt in less affluent areas where their expectations and their ability to kind of articulate what they're doing are different. So that'd be interesting to kind of hold those off in tension, I think. But that might be for another conversation. Right, Alice, I'm now, next speaker I'm very pleased to welcome is Dr. Alice Butler Walk. Alice comes to us from Robert Gordon University in Aberdeen. This evening, Alice is a human geographer and lecturer in sociology, and her research is on urban experience, stigma and marginality. And Alice has worked on these questions in relationship to climate change and place, in relationship to empire, and relationship to celebrity. And she's going to give us a talk tonight on place stigmatization and talk stuff. Thank you, Alice.
Thank you. That's great. Hopefully you should be able to see my screen now. If you can't, please do holler. So yeah, thank you for the introduction. Thanks for having me along. It's been really interesting hearing what everybody else has been working on and seeing some of those connections that come across between these different topics and people's different papers tonight. I think I was particularly taken with Michael's reference to crap towns and the shitness of place, and that's actually made me add an extra slide in to just kind of do a shameless plug really to some previous research on what people mean when they call a place a shithole. And I was listening to everyone's talks, to Will's talk just now actually, and listening to, and asking myself whether stigma and pride are total opposites, because certainly from our research in this, when we set out to try and find essentially whether there was almost like a formula or a map that we could create of the shitness of the UK and the Republic of Ireland, and we found the sort of spoiler really is that everywhere had the potential to be shit. But what was really kind of what stood out there was that actually that stigma, and this holds true in other place-based stigma research, is that actually that stigmatization of place doesn't preclude some level of pride, and that actually that stigma can be inverted in some way and become a sort of pride, usually for the residents of that area. And it's interesting and pertinent that really from this research we found that stigma towards places does exist for both residents and non-residents. And if you're interested in finding more about that, I've snuck in a QR code at the bottom there. So really to just kind of think about these questions about pride and how people think about places from a slightly different angle, but realizing that they're not totally exclusive. So generally, when I talk about anything to do with places that are stigmatized, I usually begin with that question of, if you had to think of somewhere that you think is undesirable in some way, I'm not going to ask you to share it, but usually you've got somewhere in mind, whether you want to refer to that as an undesirable place, a crap town, a shithole, etc. There's usually somewhere that comes to mind. And really, it's not important where you think it is. The question is largely why we think that those places have that negative reputation attached to it. Why are some places considered desirable? Why are some places not considered desirable? And then, of course, there's that additional question that ties in there of, and I'm not going to solve that tonight, of how in some cases that stigma then translates into a form of pride as well. So I'm really going to be focusing primarily on some of the work that I've been doing in relation to Toxteth, which is an area in the south end of Liverpool, for those who aren't familiar with it, and really kind of talk about how I went about looking at where this stigmatization of the area of Toxteth came from. Before we get into that, though, for those who aren't familiar with territorial stigma literature, I'm just going to give you a really brief overview. That really, if we're thinking about territorial stigma, generally we're thinking about the work of Loïc Wacquant, who's a French-American sociologist based at UC Berkeley. And his idea around territorial stigmatization really came out of his joining together of Bourdieu's theory around symbolic violence and Goffman's theory of stigma, with him arguing that essentially in Goffman's work, we don't really consider enough this idea of where somebody is from being something that can be attached to somebody as a form of a kind of discrediting attribute. So I won't read this very, very long quote to you, but this is from one of Wacquant's earlier pieces where he starts to tease out some of the features of territorial stigma as part of his kind of theorization around advanced marginality. But you can see that there are some things that really jump out there as being crucial, I would argue. It's really this idea of a negative public image, so something that exists in the public imagination that mean that somehow when we hear the name of a place, when we see that place on a map or we hear it on the news or whatever, we somehow associate it with certain negative connotations. And he talks about delinquency, immigration, insecurity. And what really fascinates me is this idea about how certain places then develop these kind of sort of pseudonyms or referring to places as kind of here, Little Chicago, or the Bronx of Britain, or these kinds of names, both by residents and by outsiders. He also brings in other things here about kind of class implications, his research primarily looking at Chicago or the banlieue around Paris. And this idea as well that to be, and this is crucial to Wacquant's work, that to be confined to a branded space, to be somewhere that has a negative reputation, is largely a trap, that you end up stuck there. Now, there are critiques of Wacquant's work that I have also engaged in. One of which is that, a lot of his work is from the 1980s. We're looking at a very, very different landscape, both literally and figuratively today. But largely this idea of being trapped in somewhere with a negative reputation still holds true to a certain extent. So why Toxteth? It came really from a childhood fascination, which probably tells you more about me as a child, that I grew up near Liverpool and was always really conscious of the fact that people talked about Toxteth in a certain way. And I wanted to know why, because from everything that childhood me could see, it really didn't seem, I couldn't understand why. I'm deliberately not showing you any photographs of Toxteth because I think that just contributes to Google's algorithm that kind of produces certain stereotyped images of the place, but you're welcome to look it up. Toxteth is known in some circles for, in 1981, there were a series of uprisings against structural racism. It's a predominantly Black area of Liverpool. It's quite a mixed area in terms of wealth, ethnicity, and it's got a fascinating history. As you can see, it's quite close to the docks. So there's a lot of stuff in terms of Toxteth's history, but I was really interested in thinking about, if we're thinking about this kind of archetypal place of somewhere that has stigma in the UK, how did it arrive in Toxteth? And what I really wanted to know was where this narrative comes from, because as I've said before, if we're thinking about residents of places, territorial stigma literature tells us that people who are resident in an area can derive pride from that. So how does this narrative come about that somebody who's never been to a place can still have a negative perception of a place? So I set out looking at the British press, and I looked at the Times, the Mirror, the Express, the Financial Times and the Guardian, at a sample of about 2,000 newspaper articles from 1900 to 1999 to see how Toxteth was talked about and to see whether, as we'll come back to in a second, were Kant's claim that really territorial stigma and advanced marginality are the claim of the post-1980s era actually held true. What really came out, though, was something that has come up quite a bit tonight with what Michael was talking about and Gavin as well, was the importance of language. And there are 5 key ways in which the press stigmatized Toxteth, and I don't really have time to go into all of them, but as you can see, they are all vaguely around discursive kind of framings of Toxteth, whether that's the branding of it as the inner city, which is linked to policy and politics of the Conservative Party at the time, whether that's using certain tag words or keywords to always describe Toxteth, a key one being toxic, because obviously it goes together quite nicely journalistically. Also silencing and positionality, the fact that the residents' voices are never really heard in news coverage of Toxteth. And that can even come from journalists not going to Toxteth to write about the place, they're writing about it from London, or it can come from the fact that residents' voices are the first to be cut during the editorial process. So there's a lot that kind of comes in here. We're thinking about the political economy of the press, we're thinking about how the media functions really. And then this idea at the bottom about reverse place branding, about this way that we think about how traditional place branding, you know, you transferring the social capital and the symbolic capital from a celebrity to a place. What happens when you reverse it? And just again, as another shameless plug, I had a paper come out recently that kind of considers this using Robbie Fowler, the Liverpool Football Club footballer, who's from Toxteth. And Toxteth is really used in this kind of reverse place branding way as a sort of symbolic millstone to explain consistently through media coverage why Robbie Fowler behaves in a certain way, why he acts in a certain way, why his life is going in a certain way. And it keeps coming back time and time again to explain certain aspects of his life. And interestingly, no other Liverpool Football Club player at the time had their place of birth mentioned consistently in the press in almost every single article about them. So there's a key thing going on here in terms of the branding of people and places. Interestingly, as Liverpool was becoming nominated for the Capital of Culture, the narrative around Robbie Fowler changed. And suddenly he was no longer linked to Toxteth, he was linked to Liverpool as a whole. And those stories of previous negative behaviour that had attracted the attention of the press suddenly disappeared. And he was the Liverpool God, and all sorts of other terms were brought out to garner support for that kind of City of Culture bid. So really, just to kind of finish up, the last thing I want to talk about is the element of time that plays into territorial stigma. And this is where I've critiqued really some of Kant's work, that I don't believe that territorial stigma is just the sort of claim of the post-Fordist reorganization of the economy, as he puts it. I think really, if we think logically and we think about conversations that we've had, we think about my research shows past news coverage, prior to 1980, stigma still existed. There was still negative coverage of place. Certainly it took on a different tone post-1980, but prior to that, there was still negative reputation of place. So stigmatization of place is not new. If pride around place is not new, then neither is stigmatization if we're seeing them as kind of linked in that sort of way. If we think about language and power relationships, it had to exist prior to 1980s. And my research has shown that there is this form of what I refer to as foundational stigma. There had to be these sort of traces of stigma that existed that occur prior to a major event. And that major event makes the stigma stickier and it allows it to stick for a longer period of time. But there have to be the traces there that are sort of referred to either in the press or in other kind of discursive narratives around certain attributes. Subtle references that refer to the quality of housing, for example, was a key thing in Toxteth, that give readers a certain clue about what that area is like and sends a certain message about what that place is and what it means. So I then I prefer now to refer to place-based stigma as the overarching concept, and to talk about a form of foundational stigma that precedes territorial stigma in the Wakantian sense that exists post-1980s and is really a feature of the neoliberalized economy. And I find that a helpful way to break it down, that we can see that, you know, territorial stigma doesn't come from nowhere. It has to emerge from something. We need to see that there are the kind of foundations that exist prior to that. And really to consider going forward, where does place-based stigma happen? We've kind of talked about, as a spoiler, in the UK, pretty much anywhere. Anywhere has the potential to be stigmatized for a variety of reasons. There are ethical implications of conducting research in that area. I could see there were different ways of doing that, thinking about approaching it from a pride angle, actually. But certainly, you know, going to an area and saying, I want to research your area because it has a negative reputation, there are serious ethical implications around that, and this kind of research fatigue as well in certain communities. So how do we really ameliorate the effects of place-based stigma? Not entirely sure. I think it's going to require a massive cultural shift in terms of our sense of humor, the way we talk about places, really being considering our language and the discourses that we engage with, whether we challenge people when they use certain stigmatizing attributes and stereotypes about place. But I'm hoping that the rest of the talks tonight will help me answer that final question. So I'll leave it there, and yeah, thank you all for listening, and looking forward to the discussion later on as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Alice. That was fantastic. A really useful emphasis, I think, on thinking about language, for thinking about cultural memory, thinking about the past, which I think needs to be part of this discussion. That was brilliant. And our final speaker tonight is Jack Shaw. Jack is affiliate with the Bennett Institute for Public Policy and has got a background working for both local and national government. And he's been working with the Bennett Institute on a paper on levelling up pride and policy. I think he's going to speak to that tonight. So thank you, Jack.
Fantastic. Thanks very, very much, Nikki, and great to be here. For my sins, I'll be speaking at you as well. I don't have a presentation. So my interest in pride is particularly in the context of the government's levelling up agenda. So quite similar to a lot of the themes that Will's already raised, although I think there's some kind of interesting nuance between some of your polling and some of our kind of conclusions. So my starting point is that the dimensions associated with pride and with place have been given limited thought, especially in Whitehall. And as such, some of the assumptions essentially that underpin the kind of government's conceptualisation of pride, including what it believes to be the sources of pride, but also its kind of subsequent response to boost it, means that it's not always looking in the right place. And with that in mind, I think there are just kind of 4 points really that I want to make, 2 of which I think Will has partially made, and I hope we can kind of unpick some of that in the Q&A. So the first point really is a kind of a general one, which is that, you know, there is a view held by some that rather than focusing on matters of pride, government should be addressing the underlying economic problems first. And I think we should kind of move away from that idea of boosting the kind of boosting pride is kind of quite a short-term hanging baskets style intervention, and instead recognise that the associations with pride, some of which have been mentioned already, so social capital, participation, feelings of trust and so on, can in kind of many senses intrinsically be important to identity and community resilience, but can also actually support create positive conditions for economic growth as well. My second point, and this is particularly related to what Will has said, and returning to that initial question of who owns pride, part of that is about asking where is pride located? And I think there are some kind of mischaracterizations or assumptions that are not always the case. So one of those assumptions is that pride has declined or diminished and that it needs to be restored, and that's the language that the Levelling Up white paper uses, and I'm not entirely sure it's as simple as that. So as Will's said, there's actually kind of a mixed record in many respects in that evidence, and so the idea of a kind of universal or linear decline is certainly one that is open to challenge and hasn't been challenged, I don't think. And as part of that, what often happens in my view is that there is a conflation between left behind places that have witnessed economic decline on the one hand, so post-industrial and coastal communities in particular and so on, and then those places whose emotional geography or the kind of geography of pride is the weakest. And I'm really pleased to hear lots of the panelists mention Liverpool, because Liverpool has a huge amount of deprivation, but I think, you know, they might take issue if you were to say that Liverpool's sense of pride or being a Liverpudlian was particularly weak compared to other places. So I don't think it necessarily follows that the kind of the economic geography and the emotional geography neatly map on to one another. And that's a theme, I think, particularly we see across the Northwest. And I think wellbeing data also lends some kind of legitimacy to that as well. It's far more robust, and it shows, for example, that some of the more affluent places have lower levels of well-being. And both of those assumptions of decline and where pride is weakness have kind of practical implications about where investment should be made and so on. So they are important to kind of give consideration to. The third point is that we should encourage policymakers to think in broad terms about pride, particularly because in our work at the Bennett, we draw on a lot of theory from kind of environmental psychology, really. And so lots of our thinking is located in the built environment, and improving the offer on high streets, the design of the public realm, or making cultural amenities more kind of available. All of those are important and essential, I think, to pride. But if we recognise the emotional component of pride and of places, and we kind of reject, I think, the implicit determinism that pride is the sum total of the built environment. And Will made this point actually in some of his polling, that you know, after green spaces, it was people, I think, that he said that, you know, people located their kind of source of pride in. So if we recognise those and that communities kind of have their, you know, are afforded those kind of interactions which create opportunities to tell their own stories, to tell their own histories, then I think that lends itself to thinking kind of more deeply and perhaps more creatively about the types of interventions that we think can boost pride and the mechanisms to do so as well. And we've already, again, we've heard from a couple of panelists the idea that a kind of centralized prescribed approach is perhaps not the most effective, and actually that there's lots in the space of communities that holds the key to boosting pride, and we've kind of heard those already. In particular, in our report, some of those kind of emotional themes coalesce around giving people agency and ownership in their lives, a sense of control and security that's associated with that, and kind of opportunities, and this speaks to the kind of political economy of pride, to root people to the kind of certainties that they've held dear, but they might think are kind of fading in some sense. So, you know, an idea of neighbourliness or community and so on. And I think as part of that, I was reading Martin Sambu's book, The Economics of Belonging, earlier today, and there was this really nice quote in there about thinking about levelling up in kind of addressing the challenges that those left behind places face. Rather, we need to support them to adapt to change without kind of demanding that they sacrifice community. And I think that's a really important point that's often missed. And the final point I want to make, which actually speaks to some of the stuff I think Gavin was implicitly talking about competition, is that we need to be quite ambitious about pride. There's no singular intervention that's likely to improve it, not least in the long term. And as a side note, I think the kind of temporality of pride is really interesting. And Michael talked about, you know, how long it lasted after the City of Culture. And I think that's another thing that needs to be given consideration. Instead, then, we should kind of think about the multiple dimensions that affect our sense of pride and of place. And there's clear impetus, I think, and appetite to address the political issues a sense of pride speaks to at a scale that policymakers perhaps haven't always grasped in the past. And I just want to really finish up with kind of two anecdotes that I think are particularly relevant in the kind of context and the space between ambition and pride. The first is John Ellinger's piece in the New Statesman this week, where he spoke about the colour of passports, units of measurement, and grammar schools. And it struck me that, you know, if these are attempts to restore pride, then it's a certain brand of pride, a kind of nostalgic return to the past. And that, I think we might all be in agreement, actually almost certainly won't generate pride and is a kind of ill-conceived and perhaps unambitious attempt to do so. And the second anecdote I wanted to leave with, really, and about ambition, I should be clear that being ambitious is promoting pride from top down, but also bottom up. I think there's a huge role for civic leaders, is that if we look at expressions of pride historically, civic leaders, especially in cities, have played a kind of really important role in promoting an almost kind of boosterist vision of places. Peter Shapley writes about this a lot at Bangor, and I particularly like this anecdote from Asa Briggs, who's a historian from the Victorian period, where he describes the kind of the regeneration that happens in places, and in Bradford in particular. They're building a concert hall, and the mayor of Bradford, Samuel Stafford, in the 1850s said something along the lines of, you know, our public concert hall is kind of 11 foot longer than Birmingham's, and our kind of ceiling is loftier than the one in London's. And I think that really speaks to the kind of the ambition, the tradition of pride, and almost the kind of embedded values and culture that was perhaps part of, particularly in the Victorian period, but also I think we see this in kind of the post-war and interwar period as well, which perhaps has been lost, needs to be maybe unlocked a little bit as well. So I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to the Q&A.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Jack. That's great. The idea of that kind of that comparative notion of pride that you ended on. You know, it doesn't matter really how big your concert hall is. What it matters is a little bit bigger than Birmingham's. No, that's fantastic. Really, I'm kind of blown away. 5 fantastic, open, very beautifully presented and on time paper. As a chair, all I can say is thanks. We've got lots of people who might want to turn their cameras on, or they might want to just ask questions in the chat. So I'll give people a couple of minutes, or a minute, to let that kind of settle in their minds. And I'm just going to check the chat. Will's got a... Hello, Andy. So Andy, Andy can introduce himself. Andy's our... Have you got a question for us?
I haven't. I was only going to say how enjoyable those presentations were. I thought that was the best spent hour I've had for a long time.
Thanks, Andy. I should say Andy is, being very modest, is our partner on the Historic England part of this project, and has actually kind of already spearheaded a lot of thinking and really influenced our thinking around pride and the heritage sector. So praise from him is worth something. If there's a question, Will's got a comment about, yeah.
I was just going to kick off while I have we're waiting for questions. Just Alice's paper was really interesting. Just to sort of tell a little bit of an anecdote about how when I started working in this space, Jerry Stoker and I wrote a piece called To England's, which was about the sort of growing divide between towns and cities, and it was sort of identifying. It actually drew on Jeremy Clifford in the New Statesman, and as The Economist, a great piece about from Clacton to Cambridge, about these two places that were geographically, kind of close, but were kind of different, centuries apart in some ways, and so it was kind of the sorts of places they were in terms of economic decline. And we originally called the analysis the difference between kind of cosmopolitan and shrinking places, because the idea was that essentially the kind of Cambridge kind of cosmopolitan cities, university towns, and kind of shrinking areas. But the editors of Political Quarterly said, well, these towns aren't shrinking. So we had this sort of whole debate around what we should call these places, and partly because Jerry and I have a slightly mischievous sense of humour, decided to call them backwaters, because it was a sort of play on the water rather than sort of that. But the response afterwards, actually it's quite entertaining watching politicians who are quite interested in the ideas tread very carefully around not calling places backwaters, because that's not what you do as an academic. In your ivory tower you can do that, but I learned a valuable lesson, which is that you should always be prepared that you might write a paper that people actually read, and then subsequently have to justify naming a wide range of towns across the country in a slightly pejorative way for many years since.
Yeah, it's the same thing about hotspots and cold spots. It really matters what we call them. I'm going to ask a question, because that's both my prerogative and my duty to start with. And that's what's been great is we've thought about where is pride, and we think about what is pride and all the different kinds of pride. and we've thought about when is Pride, and but what we haven't thought about, which is, and this is really cheeky because this is the question that our research is meant to answer. If I'm just going to put it out there, and it'd be helpful if you could answer it for us, is what does Pride do? In a sense, like, can we assume that Pride, or I mean, in a very, so one of the things that's been picked up by Gavin, and I know Andy's work does some of this as well, is that Pride encourages place attachment, encourages volunteering, it covers certain kind of behaviours. Is there anything else that we think that Pride does, and is it always positive? Can that be an assumption that we make at the beginning? Would be one question. Michael.
There's perhaps from Hull some evidence that Pride limits critique, and that is in the literature about Pride from others as well. And certainly there were participants that would say they felt that they couldn't criticise Hull 2017 during the year or afterwards in many cases, because to criticise the initiative would be to criticise the city. So I think when something does take on such a kind of monumental opportunity for a place, then the kind of, there were actually conferences to do with City of Culture within Hull, where people that wanted to speak out, not necessarily massively critically, to be honest, were actually shushed by other members of the audience, because to say anything negative was to talk the city down. And so yeah, I'd be interested to hear what, if there's time, what others might have to say about the role of Pride as limiting critical engagement generally.
Thanks, Michael. Fraser.
It was actually just going to be a question, so maybe I should wait until people have answered your difficult question, Nikki.
Go ahead, and they can think about my difficult one.
Yeah, this has been brilliant, and it made me think, maybe in a really ignorant way, sort of, is Pride sort of, is it produced and producing? Because we found it really interesting during the process of doing the City of Culture bid, is that I think if we had asked people if they, well, we did, if they were proud of Southampton, sort of at the beginning of the process, it wasn't really there as something that people had thought about in that context. But then as things went on and events happened, it was being visibly produced through activity and people engaging and having a place and an expression, and also recognition of different things. So do you need to have vectors in a way to make Pride occur? I find it quite interesting because, you know, from Macclesfield and Manchester, and there is a very inbuilt sense of immediate sense of, you know, that you are attracted to this place and that there is a pride in it that's sort of unquestioning, where it's quite interesting to see that being generated in a different way. So I just wondered what people thought or knew about that.
Well, Fraser, I mean, I'll start, but partly because you sort of raised it, I thought, oh, it would be a great little experimental design, you know, kind of do a pre and post survey and the impact of, you know, City of Culture bids on civic pride, actually. And I once upon a time, my academic career, did lots of work on mega events and so forth, so I should know more about this literature than I do now. But it is striking that these sorts of initiatives can seemingly focus people's mind, and that was always the argument in that sort of tourism literature, which is bizarrely for political science to know a little bit about. But boosterism was based on the idea about boosting civic pride, but also economic models as well. And so it's yeah, I'm thinking, oh, you should, if you did a pre-survey, then you should also do a post survey afterwards.
Can I add a couple of comments onto that, Nikki?
Of course, yeah, Jack.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the City of Culture stuff is, and the events are particularly interesting actually, because as part of kind of DCMS's work, it requires organisations to sign what they call a host city contract, and so we actually make organisations kind of measure pride, and so it's one of the very few examples where there has actually been pre and post evaluation, so we can see that. And Michael mentioned Hull in particular, where there's a kind of soft rise and then a kind of fall. But in other places like Glasgow, which had the Commonwealth Games before that, actually that increase was a bit more sustained. And so there, you know, perhaps there are benefits, although it strikes me that it's not really a kind of deep sense of pride, I don't think, because you then begin to get on to things like, place marketing and so on, where actually you're not kind of addressing some of the more emotional facets and dimensions of pride. So that would be one observation. And Nikki, if I can just speak to your first point about the negative associations of pride, I think you raised kind of two interesting observations, and I suppose it depends how you interpret negative. But the first is similar to Michael's actually, which is that there is some evidence that people that have strong senses of kind of place and of pride are kind of would less critically analyze those places, which could obviously prevent them from, kind of fixing some of those challenges. And we particularly see, for example, there was an example in England where those places with higher levels of pride and of place, when asked about the kind of pollution on their beaches, regardless of the objective reality, they saw those beaches as kind of nicer because they had kind of stronger levels of pride. And the other observation that I think is worthwhile is kind of the idea of place protective actions and the kind of manifestations of pride that might not always be positive. So in the context of regeneration in particular, and I noticed that there was a kind of question in relation to gentrification in the chat, I think the idea that pride can often be kind of most manifest when it feels under threat, and it can feel under threat when the built environment is changing in ways that you can't accommodate. And actually a kind of the way that could play out perhaps is that we have kind of communities more willing to kind of reject regeneration, which has kind of wider community benefits. And as a kind of side note, I actually think that place and kind of senses of place identity and pride are kind of some of the missing dimensions actually of our planning system that we never really talk about. I'm sure planners would hate me saying that, but so those are some thoughts I'd take away from that.
Brilliant, thank you, Jack. I think Gavin's been waiting.
Thank you. Yeah. I would just say, in terms of pride, one of the interesting things is to almost argue from analogy with individual pride. So what happens, of course, with pride is it can encourage further attempts to achieve or to reach those standards again, or to improve. So with kind of more collective pride, you can often have this sense of kind of wanting to achieve more. But equally, of course, if there has been some achievement, then sometimes that can also lead to a sense of wanting to defend that, of maintaining that. And so that's where kind of pride, in the individual sense and in the collective sense, can be more than about defensive forms. But I guess just quickly also, there's two projects I worked on, one from Brazil around the World Cup there, and one that I published on in relation to South Africa, which was the one particularly with Brazil first, was there was this sense of kind of with the World Cup, there were a lot of people who protested, and we interviewed many people who protested around the World Cup bid being, something that was hugely divisive and expensive. But then once the event arrived, people shifted without feeling a sense of contradiction to that, they couldn't criticize it anymore. They actually had a sense of loyalty now that the events had come around. So that was one aspect. And then with the World Cup in South Africa, I've forgotten my main point there. Oh yeah, it was just this, so a concept of emotional capital can be really useful to look at, because people there commented on the contrast between the feelings they had about the megasport event, the World Cup in Johannesburg, and the improvements and the attention and everything they saw, but then feeling that this couldn't be used for everyday or political purposes. So this contrast between the two, that they often express frustration that why couldn't we have this solidarity and unity normally? So solidarity and unity within group is also another aspect of group-based or collective pride.
Thanks, Evan. That's really, really useful to think about that idea that we could transfer pride from one thing to another. We have pride in one event, and then how can we use it for another?
Yep. How can you mobilize it for another occasion?
Can I capture it?
Yep.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alice.
Hi, thank you. I was initially going to come back to your question, Nikki, about what does pride do? And was going to try and turn it around and think, well, what does the inverse do? If we know what the effects of stigma are, can we say, well, we know that that results in a decrease in funding and those kinds of things, and a creation of the circumstances by which gentrification can occur. So if we flip that on its head, can we see what the opposite would be? And then as Jack was talking, and then as Gavin was talking, I started to think about, is there a way then that we break down the kind of pride that we're talking about? I think there's certainly this almost top-down imposed type of pride that's almost based on a sort of nationalistic, nostalgic view of let's all come together around X, Y, and Z. And then you've got the sort of bottom-up solidarity, was I think the word I was looking for, Gavin, which again could probably be broken down into a sort of almost active pride and then a sort of defensive pride. And again, the example that Jack used about the Commonwealth Games took me to Kirstine Payton's work on Glasgow and the Commonwealth Games, and the fact that you had the Commonwealth Games that were being promoted as this nationally top-down type of pride of we're all coming together to celebrate this imposed vision of Commonwealth ideals, versus the pride that then came out from the residents of the housing developments and areas of Glasgow that were going to be destroyed to make way for the Commonwealth Games and developments associated with it. So you had the two different kinds of pride that were associated with that event. You had the almost unnaturally imposed type, and then you had this almost, I don't know, I'm hesitant to say natural, that came up almost organically from the community. So I suppose it's then thinking about how do we categorize pride in relation to place, and is there almost a way that we can break it down into thinking about different types, a sort of typology of pride?
Yeah, thanks, Alice. And I think that's one of the things I'm thinking about and taking off on that literature, talking about authentic and hubristic pride. How do you think about that in terms of the collective? There is a question that some of you have already kindly addressed that's gone into the chat, which is asking about gentrification and pride in terms of in terms of stigma. So I'm struggling with mine. Can we open up the discussion to the impact of gentrification on stigmatized territories and the pride of place that engenders? I think, how does stigmatization, how does gentrification change pride, and what does that do for different communities?
I'd be happy to jump in if that's all right. There's some great literature by Hamish Callan and Tom Slater where they talk about, particularly thinking about Edinburgh, which obviously isn't usually thought about in relation to territorial stigma. You tend to think of Scotland's other city of Glasgow as being the place that you associate with stigma, which is interesting in and of itself. What is quite interesting is they see that gentrification and stigma are very intricately linked, and that they demonstrate kind of two sides of the same coin essentially, and that one is used to perpetuate the other. So they argue that there's this cycle that occurs whereby the narrative or the discourse of stigmatization of a particular place leads to the decline in investment in that particular place, which then leads to further stigmatization, and then there emerges this necessity for gentrification to turn that narrative around. So they argue that a lot of that stigmatization is politically operationalized and economically operationalized in order to lay the groundwork essentially for gentrification. And then miraculously, the stigmatization disappears, particularly when you can introduce things like sort of rebranding of an area or something like that. So I think what the research around Toxteth that I've been working on shows is that the stickiness of stigma doesn't go away after a place has been gentrified. It still has that sort of that name or those attributes attached to it, but often those attributes are what attract people in the first place. So in Toxteth, the sort of narrative around the grittiness or the edginess really played into people's desire to live there because they wanted the authentic urban experience. And just tangentially, the property developer Urban Splash do that quite significantly in some of their advertising for new developments that are generally in kind of gentrified areas. And one that struck me a few years ago was they described that you could have your very own Coronation Street experience in one of their housing developments that they were building. So it's this sort of sense of using stigma in order to attract people to get this authentic experience, whatever you want to take authentic as kind of byword for. But I think to answer the question in a very long-winded way, I think you can say that even after a place has been gentrified, it takes a long time for the stigma that existed to dissipate. Certainly it changes, but it still sticks for an extended period of time.
Thank you. And the stickiness of stigma is my favourite phrase of the evening. So I was very pleased to say that more times. And the idea that the complications of pride existing alongside other things all the time, and they're not negating each other, which Gavin talked about so beautifully, is really important. Helen, last question for Professor Nicholson. Mute, Helen. No, we can't hear you, Helen. Can you unmute? Can I unmute you?
Somebody need to unmute.
I think. Can we unmute?
Muted yourself again, Helen.
Interesting. Have you unmuted me now?
Now we can hear you.
You'd muted me. I couldn't get myself out of it. Thank you. That was fascinating. I'm kind of interested in pride as a deficit model, actually, and whether I work in Slough, and that's got some issues around external perceptions of Slough, not necessarily internal. So there are two things that really chime with this debate. One is that the questions around do they feel pride to many of the communities that have been working with are inherently stigmatizing. They only see the need for questions of pride because they see it as a deficit model, and they see people who live in Slough love it. You know, they really like that. What they object to is other people's perception of what Slough is, and particularly those sort of that circularity, which I described so beautifully around, stigma towards pride and back again. So in answer to your question, is there a sort of negative to pride? Well, in a sense, it is the question in itself assuming a level of stigmatization or potential for stigmatization. And I ask that with people of Slough in my ears.
Thank you, Helen. Yeah, that's a brilliant question, and I think it's partly behind one of our questions is what does it do just to ask it? So that might be the kind of performative. What is it to ask someone to display it, to manifest it? And that goes back to kind of Gavin's thing about when is it shown, when is it manifested, when is it just kind of latent? How do we ever capture that kind of pride? But one of the things that we're discovering more and more is that it's about being seen. It's about the external viewpoint rather than from kind of always emanating from within. So I don't know if anyone's got any comments they want to make about Helen's last question. It was such a great one. I can leave us.
Well, perhaps it just relates to the title of the webinar. Whose pride is it anyway, and where is that gaze going? We haven't really talked about class massively, but this is often in these discussions we're talking about working class or former working class places, and I think relating to the gentrification question, does this sort of regime of pride make those places perform a certain emotion for the sake of the people coming in to do the gentrification and money making?
I really, Jack.
I'm happy to close in the next 30 seconds, given the time. I don't think this is quite going to answer your question in the way that you anticipated, Helen, but I was thinking about what the consequences of not asking about pride were. And I think one of the kind of challenges is that we often use quite a lot of proxies around community spirit, belonging, local area satisfaction, and so on. And I often think they kind of mask some of the kind of idiosyncrasies of pride, actually. And I think across those proxies, there are kind of really big variations. And that's one of the real challenges with some of the methodologies, that if you look at lots of the, say, composite indexes and they talk about pride, actually they're talking about so much more than pride, that they end up talking about something that's completely different to a meaningless from pride. So I think there are greater challenges in not asking that question than there are in asking that question.
That's a great ending. Thanks, Jack. I'm gonna wrap up. Rebecca, Rebecca is the director of the programme that funds us, so I do have to, like, this is that kind of moment, and a word from my funder, I do have to let Rebecca speak.
And actually, Nikki, I was just coming on to wave goodbye because I thought you were wrapping up. But as the director, I'll say what a wonderful event and a really great project as part of the 9 project, and look forward to seeing where the conversations go with this big piece of work, but a fantastic start. So, and then I'll just wave goodbye prematurely now.
Thanks, everyone. So all I would say in my wrapping up is that the project runs for the rest of 2022, and that we're going to have another webinar. We're going off and we're doing some field work now, and we're going to have another webinar in September when we're going to be looking at Pride and policy implications and applications. And so do please keep in touch. And we also have a community of practice, which is a slightly sort of separate group in which we look at kind of methodological problems and methodological issues, and we work with our partners much more closely in our heritage organisations and our local authorities. If you'd like to be part of either of those, you know, we know where you are now, you know where we are. Please just do keep in touch, and thank you so much. A really warm, obviously, pride feeling in me, but thanks very much for giving your time this evening.
Thanks, Nikki. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. You should be proud.